Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us today. The ASA is very excited to be co-hosting this event with Sports Africa on the eve of the Olympic opening ceremony. And we have a very full program today, so without further ado, please welcome Martha, who will introduce the panelists.
All right, welcome everyone. I am going to say just share my screen just briefly, and yeah, let's see, here it is, say a few words of introduction. So first of all, this is our panel, Africa and the Olympics, Race, Gender, Power on the Road to Tokyo. I want to introduce, I'm Martha Saavedra, the Associate Director of the Center for African Studies at UC Berkeley, and I'm an active member of the Sports Africa Board. So today we're thrilled to be collaborating with the African Studies Association on this members exclusive event. And we'll be exploring just a few of the fascinating issues that the world will see unfold in the next 18 days in Japan. Before I introduce our panel today, I want to say a bit about Sports Africa, a coordinate organization of the African Studies Association. And I also, after that, I'll say a few things to set up some of the discussion that we'll be having. So Sports Africa started with a conversation in 2003 at the ASA in Boston. After that, we began to organize conferences at Ohio University in Athens, starting in 2004. Since then, we've organized 15 international conferences. The last few have been either in Africa or hosted by African universities. So our most recent one occurred at the end of June, hosted by Nelson Mandela University. And I believe the videos for that are actually on the Nelson Mandela University YouTube channel. So what is Sports Africa? Well, our goal is to advance African sports studies. And what you see on the screen is part of a flyer, and you can have access to that flyer to give you the succinct printed knowledge of what it is. But what we are is an intellectually vibrant, creative, and passionate community of practitioners and academics. We aim to be interdisciplinary, inclusive, accessible, and an integral part of the global conversation on scholarships and sport. So in order to become a member, you can join us, and it doesn't cost that much to join us. We, as an affiliate, working with the African Studies Association, it is all done through their website and their portal. You don't actually have to join the African Studies Association to become a Sports Africa member, but we really highly recommend that you do that, and it helps us in our relationship with the African Studies Association. And I also want to point out that for those who are on the continent, there are rates that make it much more affordable to be able to join. And so Alex, who's on the call, if anybody ever has questions about how to manage that portal, I think there's some really good instructions on the African Studies website itself. But if you do have questions, Alex and others, Catherine and others at the association are the ones to ask. So that is Sports Africa. As for the Olympics, we're going to be talking a lot today about different aspects of the Olympics. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. Many people wonder why the heck we are doing this right now in the middle of a global pandemic, and I think we haven't really figured that out yet. I'm not going to read what's on the screen here, but these are just some of the ideas that have come up in general about what the Olympics are. In terms of Africa at the Olympics, I wanted to give you a big overview really quickly. And note that this year there are 53 African countries participating. Yesterday, Guinea pulled out, so we don't have the full 54 countries this year. And that makes up over 25%, over a quarter of all the countries that are participating. Yet, it's less than 10% of the athletes there. So we can go into why that is. Maybe you already can figure out some obvious things. I did also, because we're going to be talking about gender, I wanted to point out that in terms of overall, and these are quick numbers that I stole from a website, Olympimedia, and I think that the numbers are changing rapidly as different athletes maybe withdraw or have COVID problems or something like that. So the numbers, particularly for the Tokyo Olympics, will change. But in terms of participation of men and women, we do see that in terms of African countries, and this is both Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, that of the teams going, only 42% of the athletes are women. And I just wanted to do some quick comparisons with other regions of the world. And boldly, we don't really have, Africa needs a lot of catching up to do. If we break it down by sub-region, the African region as a whole, the African continent as a whole, does better than the Middle East, does better than Central America, but we have work to do. But I do want to give an overview over time. And again, these are big numbers that I crunched quickly, that the participation of women has increased over time, although with some dips here and there. And I'm not going to go through all these numbers here, but just to give you a visual, and the axes are not working correctly here, but that gives you some sense that there is some gain over time, and maybe, hopefully, maybe at the next Olympics we'll reach parity in terms of men and women there. So the Olympics, again, with all the critiques of why are we holding this now, I want to just say it is a process and a state of being for the individual athletes of just getting there in some cases. And I do want to just highlight one athlete who I've been thinking about a lot, Samia Youssef Omar. She's from Somalia. She competed in the 2008 Beijing Olympics in the 200 meters and came in last. I talked with her, but I never actually was able to meet her. And in the meantime, she drowned. And she was one of the many Africans who tried to make it across the Mediterranean. She was trying to train for the London Olympics, and was trying to find a coach, was trying to get to Europe, and she drowned off the coast of Italy. What she said is, we know that we are different from the other athletes, but we don't want to show it. We try our best to look like the rest. We understand we are not anywhere near the level of the other competitors here. We understand that very well, but more than anything else, we would like to show the dignity of ourselves and our country. Now, I know that there's many African athletes who will medal, and so we do have some, who are going to be just excellent to watch as athletes. But many of the athletes, not just the African athletes, are there just to participate. And while we can critique the Olympics a lot, I do want to think about the dignity of each of the athletes that are there. So with that, we're going to move to the panel now. And the panelists include Simon Akindes, and he will be speaking about Lee Evans. Según Odegbami may join us, but we have been in conversation with him. He was connected with Lee Evans in Nigeria. Michelle Sikes from Pennsylvania State University. Nobubele Phuza from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and she was a great help in the conference that we did recently, helped make sure that was a really successful event. Peter Alegi from Michigan State University, who has been one of our stalwart companions in this journey since 2003. So I'm going to leave it at that. They're going to introduce their own papers, and now I have to figure out how to get out of here, stop sharing. Okay, that is, I'm going to hand it back over to the panelists now, and Simone, you can go first. Okay, Simone.
Simone, you're muted.
Okay. Oh, I was greeting everybody, and I'm going to share my screen, but maybe I would like to say again, thank you to Marta, and then to all those, Peter, Michelle, and all those on the Sports Africa board, of which I'm a member too, for organizing this. The topic of my talk today is not so much about Lee events. I think Peter and we had a conversation about this, and then it has changed a little bit. So now I'm just going to share my screen, and then we'll go from there. Can you see my screen? Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what I'd like to discuss very quickly is the place that Africa has occupied within the Olympic movement and the Olympics themselves over time, from the beginning until now, if possible, but this is going to be brief. And then secondly, given the recent successes of African athletes or those who are competing for other countries, I'm going to try to make sense of what it means for Africans at home or abroad to win medals. I assume that I have 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay, good. So the way I look at the Olympics is that it's a theater of power. The Olympic Games were created within the framework of winning medals, overpowering the opponent, and receiving worldwide acclaim. It is certainly the biggest theater for nations to display the power, the industry, the dominance over others. Even individual success is also quickly evaluated in relation to identity, culture, nation, and so on and so forth. It is not just a game. It is more than a game. The 2021 Olympics are turning into a 20 billion bust. Let me see, there's something that is not quite right here. I'm sorry, it's nothing that's not quite, yeah, this is where I should be. Okay, the games were created just 12 years after 1885 Berlin Conference. It was the pinnacle of colonialism and imperialism, with the slave trade and all forms of marginalization and plundering in its trails. When Joseph Conrad wrote his novel, or published his novel in 1902, that he kind of fictionalized one way or another the way Africa was looked at in those days. And that is going to be the subjects of discussion and controversy later on. And then we can talk about that. This is a story of two Algerian athletes who won, the marathon for France. One in, the first one, Ahmed El-Wafi, that was in 1928, and Alain Mimoun was later, but they had a different fate. I would like to talk a little bit more about them if we have time when we get to the Q&A or when we get to the discussion part. But there are interesting stories when it comes to the fate of athletes, especially when they deal with the colonial power, if you want, the system that was in place in those days was very interesting. In 1960, Africa arrives, that was the time of independence in most countries, and the Africans started participating in the Olympics. Abebe Bikila wins the marathon in 68. In Mexico, Kano wins the 150, 500 meter, and then John Akibua wins the 400, 100 meters in 1974. And Tulu Deraltu, who is Ethiopian, was the first African athlete woman to win a gold at the Olympics. And then after that, we've had a long string of African athletes in the Olympics. So who's got the power to host the games? As you can see in this map, where the game is circulating, and then you can see Africa big, and it is not soon that we're going to host the game. By 2032, the games would have been organized 17 times in Europe, if we include Russia, 5 times in the USA, 3 times in Australia, 4 times in Asia, twice in Latin America, and and once in Canada. So the 2021 Olympics are turning into a big budget, $20 billion. And this is to tell you that this is enormous, for many countries. For example, for Benin, where I come from, the GDP in 2019 was not even $15 billion. So who's got the power to make decisions? Of course, the executive committee of the IOC, all right? And in that executive committee, you have 17 members. Only one is an African woman, only 2 Africans. One is an African woman from Zimbabwe, and the other one is the famous Moroccan Olympian, Nawal El Moutawakil. So that tells you how the decisions are made and maybe for whom the decisions are made. Who has the power to send full delegations to the game? China is sending 431 athletes to the game. I mean, that's not the delegation. Maybe the title is wrong. Here it's the athletes. The USA is sending 661 athletes, Nigerian 60 and Guinea 5. And Martha was saying earlier, Guinea is not even participating. They are saying that because of COVID, they cannot make it. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but that is the official reason. Who's got the power to choose official Olympic sports, games? Who's got the power to map and who's got the power to label? In Tokyo, there will be 111 swimming medals. That's a lot. And when you consider that no African country really competes in those medals, you can see clearly where the gap is already with that, with such decisions. This year, karate, skateboarding, sports climbing, and surfing have been included in the games. So I would love to see Senegalese wrestling in the game someday. Who's got the power to win? When you look at the total of medals, Europe has 11,709 medals, and then you look at Africa, 404 medals. That tells you again the type of picture that the game is, that the game represents, if you want, the gaps, the inequality that exists even, in the medal count. Who's got the power to train? The best facilities are not in Africa, and athletes tend to train in Europe, with the exception of a few, all right? But some Africans are getting the facilities that they need now. Who's got the power to sponsor and advertise? These are the worldwide Olympic partners for Tokyo Olympics. Coca-Cola, Airbnb, you can see yourself. Here you have 12 of them. Let me see, 14 of them, and all of them are outside Africa. All 15 gold partners are Japanese, all Olympic official partners, all Olympic official supporters are Japanese. African corporations are missing. Who's got the power to use performance-enhancing drugs and not to be caught? Mr. Manfred Donike, I think, used a new technique to identify abnormal levels of testosterone you know, and then 20% of the specimens he tested were, including those from 16 gold medalists, would have resulted in disciplinary proceedings had the test been official. This tells you again where the gap is when it comes to testing who can do it and who can get away with it. So what does it mean for an African to win a medal, especially a gold one? It psychologically boosts the self-confidence of Africans, and those countries which do not have the power that I identified earlier. Every medal, especially outside of running events, challenging the many myths that have fueled the science of races about the connection between ability, body, skin, and performance. Peter and Nobu are probably going to talk about that when they elaborate on race and gender. It creates some form of solidarity among the powerless and the hope that things can change. So this is my conclusion so to speak. The Olympics clearly reflect the distribution of power in the world, and its organizers do not seem to want it different. Athletes have always been aware of that and have contested that order, including Africans. A few surprises await us at Tokyo, as Tommy Smith, who protested in 1968 in Mexico, implied in an article I read yesterday in the New York Times. The Olympics for African countries situated at the periphery of the Games and often invisible remains a promise. It is for them a dream, to use the vocabulary so common among the few winners that are interviewed. Everybody's talking about it's a dream come true. It's a dream come true. Yes, it is for individuals. All right. It is still a promise for the advent of a fair and plain level fields of real competition, which hardly exist at this time. So Africans are still hoping that one day they can move, you know, I mean, they know that they have a lot of work to do. And as Martha pointed out earlier, they hope that they can be better and catch up with others, if catching up is what is to be done. I'm afraid that the current financial flows, drive to privatize and monopolize everything, the technological progress in training equipment and management of the games and management of athletes also might create bigger and bigger gaps and leave the continent further behind. But in the meantime, every single gold medal that an African wins will symbolize the refrain of civil rights song, "Oh, I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved." Just like the tree planted by the water, I shall not be moved. So that will be my conclusion for now. Martha, or who is?
Right, sorry, yes. So next up is, Según, did he join us? I don't think so. So next up is Michelle. Michelle, are you, I know she was restarting her laptop. Oh, there she is. Okay. All right, take it away, Michelle.
Michelle, I believe you're muted.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And thanks to the African Studies Association and to Sports Africa for this opportunity to speak with you about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, the history of women's distance running in Kenya. I wrote my PhD on that topic, and I currently research and teach on the topic of sport in Africa as an assistant professor of kinesiology, African studies, and history at Penn State University. The title of my remarks today is Blazing the Trail: Gender, Sport, and Kenyan Women Who Achieved the Extraordinary. After the first major meet of the 1973 Kenyan domestic track and field season, a report in the Kenyan broadsheet, the Daily Nation, declared that the two-time Olympian Tekla Chembwe had won the long jump against no competition. In December that year, at the Kenyan trials to achieve qualification for the Christchurch Commonwealth Games in January 1974, the highlight was 13-year-old Rose Tata's qualifying time in the 800 meters. It was, quote, all the more impressive for there were only two competitors in this race. Tata's excellent time and Chembwe's victory stood out amidst the low level of female participation at these events. The Kenyan media regularly bemoaned the dearth of women in track and field and remained preoccupied with the fact that Kenya's female athletes were not, quote, keeping pace with the men. The Daily Nation in 1972 trumpeted 6 more for Munich. That meant the Munich Olympic Games. Women failed to shine. At the Kenyan National Championships that year, Kenyan men broke 4 national records and achieved 6 additional qualifying times for the 1972 Munich Olympics. The men's 800 meters event was, quote, expectedly another great race with an incredibly high-class field going to the start, part of an afternoon of excitement that culminated in Ben Jiptu winning the 3,000-meter steeplechase in a fabulous Kenya best ever time of 8 minutes, 28 seconds. Enthusiasm waned for the women as the Daily Nation observed, quote, again, the fact has been underlined that the women are going to require a great deal more attention over the next few years if their performances are to compare favorably with that of the men. Daily Nation sports editor Philip Ndu wondered why, quote, home of middle distance runners like Kip Keino did not feature women running to the same standard. Warming to the theme in another piece, he lamented, quote, Kenya is littered with numerous women athletes who have shown great potential at the tender ages, only to fade away when they should be maturing. It would take until the 1990s for headlines to begin signaling a new era in Kenyan women's distance running, with the Daily Nation reporting that the upcoming 1992 Olympic Games were, quote, women's best chance since Mexican debut. Women accounted for a small fraction of total Olympic participation by Kenyans from independence in 1963 to the LA Games of 1984. The slide here shows the number of male and female Kenyans who represented their country at the 4 Olympic Games attended by Kenyan athletes during this 21-year period. If you compare the total number of competitors for events run by both sexes, you can see that far more men competed than women. And as a quick aside, why I included the keywords events for both sexes is because the incremental rollout for women's distance events meant that the women's Olympic program did not reach and match exactly the men's program until, in fact, 2008 with the addition of the women's 3,000 meter steeplechase. But here you can see in 1960, the longest women could run at the Olympics was the 800 meters, and it's not until 1972 that the 15 meters is introduced for women at the Olympics. So this is the difference in the 2 charts, the blue and the orange, with the orange bars corresponding to the events that were available to women And you can still see that if we only look at those events, still Kenya is sending far more men than they were able to send women. So in the book that I'm writing about the history of Kenyan women's distance running, I go into detail about why I think this underperformance of Kenyan women took place during these years. But in the time that remains with us today for this exciting panel on Africa and the Olympics, I instead want to focus on a woman who was part of that important 1968 Mexico City debut. Her name is Tekla Tshembe. Those games, the famous Mexico City Olympic Games, started on October 12th, 1968. With hundreds of participants from across the world, Kenya was making history of its own. Not only for emerging as one of the top track nations in the world, finishing second to the United States, and not only for the 8 medals won in track and field, with gold medals won by Kipkeino in the 1500, Naftali Temu in the 10,000, by Amos Biwat in the 3,000 meter steeplechase, in addition to silvers in the men's 800 meters, 3,000 meter steeplechase, and 4x400 meter relays, plus a bronze medal in the 5,000. Kenya also made history because for the first time in 1968, the country sent female athletes to participate in the world's biggest sporting event. Tekla Tshembe was part of that debut, one of 3 Kenyan women that you see here pictured, including Lydia Stevens and Elizabeth Chesser, to represent their nation in Mexico, and she was the youngest of the 3 athletes. The truth is that we lied, she says. Back then, you couldn't get a passport unless you were 18 years old and above. They had to make us 18 in order for me to get a passport. That's why the date of birth given, and which remains online, is July 3rd, 1950. The Kenyan officials had to cheat and make me 18, says Tekla, who was, in fact, born in 1954, into a family of 7 children. She was raised by her grandmother alongside her older brother, as her mother was an only child and her grandmother wanted to look after the children. She was close with her brother and hunted with the boys and played the games they were interested in as children. Tshembe explains, quote, "We would hunt birds and I became very good at it. I learned a lot from being around boys. I was always a sporty person, but athletics wasn't my first love. I used to play football in my early school days with the boys. As I grew, I then became interested in volleyball." When her sporting ability was discovered by her school, Tshembe was quickly brought into every event that she could participate, especially when the competitions involved other schools. As she puts it, I would run the 100-meter sprint, then do the long jump, then the 400 meters, and so on. She entered divisional track and field competitions, then district meets, and eventually reached the national level, running the 400 as her specialty event. I used to run for fun and just to ensure I was defeating the other people in the race with me. Before I even knew what was going on, they told me that I had qualified for the 1968 Olympics, says Tekla. When the Kenyan team traveled together to Mexico City, it was the first time that Tshembe flew on a plane. Her excitement remains palpable today. I didn't care whether I was going to run or not. I was getting on a plane to visit a new place. Back then, unlike now, we weren't trained to run, so winning or losing wasn't exactly a big deal. I was meeting new people, and for the first time, I was in close quarters with white people, and even eating with them in the same dining hall. I wasn't used to those things. I didn't know we were the first female contingent of Kenyans participating at the Games, she says. Tekla ran the 12th fastest time in the heats at Mexico City, even though she was eliminated in the first round after finishing 5th in her heat. Nonetheless, she had made history and would do so again 4 years later when she qualified for the 1972 Munich Olympics, this time one of only 2 Kenyan women to represent Kenya at the Olympic Games. Training was not there. We did not have coaches. When I went to Kapsabet Girls High School, we were being encouraged to do interval runs and sprints. By the time I was doing the 1972 Olympics, I had improved to progress to the second round, but still got eliminated. You have countries like the US, Jamaica, Cuba, so Kenya could not feature for sprint because I didn't have a coach. However, due to the experience I was getting, I managed to get gold at the All Africa Games in 1973. During a meet around this time, she encountered Dr. Dorothy Bridges, who asked if she would consider accepting a scholarship to the United States. Having finished her studies in Kenya, Tekla seized the opportunity to move to the US on a track scholarship, where she began competing for Chicago State University before moving to the University of New Mexico. Tekla credits the coaching she received to helping her to perform well in the 1978 Commonwealth Games in Edmonton, where she won a silver medal, finishing 0.05 of a second behind Australia's Judith Peckham. She had also qualified to compete at the 1976 Montreal Olympic Games, but lost that opportunity when Kenya boycotted those games in opposition to New Zealand's participation after the All Blacks rugby team decided to tour South Africa in defiance of the anti-apartheid. So I know I'm running short on time, and I will conclude here by saying that Tekla Chembwe is one of the first female runners to represent Kenya at the Olympic Games. She traveled the world and earned international acclaim. She also competed during what I call the fragile period for women's running in Kenya, from the 1960s to late 80s, when women made advances but failed to capitalize or match the men. Studying the lives of Kenya's female sports pioneers creates an opportunity to see how girls and women negotiated or failed to negotiate their new roles as competitive athletes, global citizens, and eventually community patrons. I look forward to hearing the next presentation and to taking questions at the end. Thank you again.
All right, now we turn it over to Nobubele. Are you ready? Hopefully the power shedding is not preventing you.
Yeah, no, the ancestors are still with us on that one. So I'm hoping load shedding doesn't sabotage the kind of conversations that we're trying to have today. Thank you, Martha, for the introduction. My name is Nobubele. My surname is Phuza. Most people refer to me as Nobu, and I'm okay with that as well. As Martha did allude in the beginning, I'm going to be just chatting about specifically the ban of our girls from Namibia, Beatrice Maselingi and Christine Mboma. And I think by now, it's hardly a surprise when we hear another woman from the Global South being excluded from elite athletic events because of their natural testosterone levels. I think all of us are familiar with the story of Mugadi Caster Semenya, who is still fighting the decision by IAAF for her to lower her testosterone levels or change the races that she competes in. So Beatrice Maselingi and Christine Mboma, who are 18-year-old 400-meter sprinters from Namibia, are just the latest to be barred from competing in an Olympic event. They joined Black African athletes like Aneta Nagesa, Margaret Mwambui, Francine Nisioma, and of course, Caster Semenya. In the statement from Namibia National Olympic Committee, we gather that the athletes will be looking at changing their events from 400 meters to 100 meters or 200 meters. And the science behind it is beyond the scope of this conversation. But briefly, high testosterone levels are reported to only affect performance in distances between 400 meters to 1,600 meters. So athletes with differences of sex development or DSD can only compete in distances that are greater than 1,600 meters or 100 meters. Women started the stance of World Athletics objective scientific measure to spot in popular media is in this offering today. I'm avoiding entertaining this question directly, but I want to focus on why the insistence on measuring, checking, verifying, and eventually policing femaleness reinforces the ontology of the Black athlete in the way that the European colonizer had constituted it. My intention is to place a reminder that Beatrice and Christine's ban is a continuation of the onslaught of whiteness and patriarchy on Black bodies. I'll make 2 points here, Chair, and then I'll conclude. The first point is that sport is a male preserve. It's difficult for us to have a conversation about femininity and Black femaleness in sport outside of masculinity. This is because the appearance of women in the sport field is already a violation of the public-private dichotomy that we are all familiar with. Sport as a very public practice continues to be a male preserve, a space where men cultivate, test, prove, and perform their masculinity. Men enjoy the privilege of not being policed in terms of appearance, gender performance, masculinity, and so on. Women, on the other hand, have always been a spectacle in sport. They are already out. They are already out of place when in a sporting field, rather than the safety of home or the church. They are already out of place when they have masculine physiques, masculine behavioral traits, and worse still, are openly lesbian. So already the existence of women in sport is sufficient to question whether they are real women or not. The actual sex verification is just an additional reminder that the original citizen in sport is a man, and that women will be tolerated if they conform to the standards of being women placed by white and male authorities in the North. Testosterone has been placed as the one distinguishing marker between male and female sporting bodies, but testosterone still belongs to men in symbolic ways. By this, I mean that high levels of testosterone are allowed to exist in men to the extent that they have boundless claim to masculinity and physical prowess. For example, you have Usain Bolt and NBA champion currently, Giannis Antetokounmpo. And both of these men have been celebrated for being anomalies among their peers, with their competitive advantage unquestioned. Yet for women, there is a ceiling for excellence, one that borders on the edges of masculinity or maleness even. There is no superwoman, there is no Greek freak, there is no lightning bolt, there are just women and then pseudo men. The second point is that Black women are out of place. The Black female body has always been a target and a marker of pathology and deviance. Within the history of enslavement, colonialism, and white supremacist discourse, Black women's bodies have been objectified and masculinized. You'll recall the curiously persistent theoretical focus on Sarah Usarki-Batman as the icon of racial and sexual alterity. This is an argument strongly purported by Shirley Ann Tate, who grapples with the idea of Black beauty shame and white beauty standards from the viewpoint of post-colonial feminism. In Black beauty shame, intensification, skin ego, and biopolitical silencing, Tate argues that bodies are generally constructed through a racialized body normative, which favors the white heterosexual body of the colonizer. Biopolitical racializing assemblages are employed to make society read Black skin, Black hair, Black bodies, Black facial features as intensely abnormal. Tate's work proposes that the similarity between Black sportswomen who have been questioned on their femininity, sexuality, or strength is that they have been marked as Black beauty shame objects. As a result of their physical appearance, they do not lay claim on true white-approved womanhood and are then unlocated from femininity. The construction of the Black athletes in this way is the logical endpoint of European colonialism. Beatrice, Christine, Casta, Francine, Margaret, Annette, they are all constituted from a combination of pre-existing centuries-old scientific tales of Blackness. The Black body is dangerous. The Black body is hypermasculine. The Black body possesses raw energy. And all these narratives only intensify when you have media accounts of Black female athletes being equated, their physicality and their athletic performance being equated to animals. There are many examples of this in media. And Douglas Booth asserts that the association of Black female sports performance with animals repeats the colonial view that they are not real women while protecting the normative status of and importance of white female self. Evident in the case, specifically Caster Semenya's case with the IAAF, is that the positioning of Black females as inhuman also renders their athletic talent and success as unbeatable. The underlying message is that Black women do not run like white women. They run like animals or men. You'll remember Lindsay Sharp, who won the world sympathy when she tearfully described how difficult it was to compete against athletes with DSD. This is who World Athletics is actually protecting. I want to conclude, Chair, with the call that Margaret Wambui presented in an interview with BBC in May this year. She says athletics needs a third category beyond men and women. World Athletics should introduce a new category of athletes like her, with athletes who have different sexual development or DSD. Now, my thoughts are that had a third category existed already, it would have given Beatrice and Christine an opportunity to compete in the 2020 Olympics, agreed. But the currently known DSD athletes only make up 0.7% of the total number of competitors, which makes it impractical to have a competitive third category. Perhaps having the category will encourage more female athletes to get tested or discourage female athletes from taking the prescribed hormones or getting surgery done. But I suspect that this third category would be populated with mostly athletes from the global South, which is problematic for the narratives around true womanhood and Blackness. What I think we should be occupying ourselves with is firstly, thinking critically about how World Athletics treats bodies that don't conform to the Western gender binary. It might be an interesting insight of how it treats the Africa and the global South in general. We need to be curious as well and curiously imagine what would be the possibility if Africa was the standard or the center for gender. If, as Oyewumi Oyeronke suggests, that femininity and masculinity were just spaces in athletics available to be occupied by anybody, what kind of competitions would we be participating in then? What would we be teaching about gender? And mostly, what would we be teaching about the West and about belonging? Thank you.
Thank you. That's really important. I'm going to turn it over to Peter now, and he'll explore another aspect of the Africa and the Olympics. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Martha, and hello, everyone. As a historian, I'd like to go back and in the few minutes at my disposal, talk about the Olympic boycott against apartheid, which before the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, first in North America and then internationally, was quite possibly the most widespread and successful anti-racism campaign in sports. And the story began, of course, with the development of modern South Africa and the context of sports in a white settler colonial society was one defined by segregation and inequality. Of course, I don't have time to go into the details, but one way to think about the social, economic, and political inequality in South African sport and society is to look at the facilities that were available to the white minority and the Black majority in the 20th century. And so these two images bring that inequality and that segregation out quite dramatically. On the one hand, you had a world-class rugby stadium, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously used sports grounds at Newland Stadium in the southern suburbs of Cape Town in 1949 for the all-white Springbok rugby side. And just a few miles as the crow flies in Ndabeni, right next to present-day Langa Township in Cape Town, a typical sandlot facility where a Black soccer match was underway, that one in the 1920s. The political and legal grounds on which the boycott was built was linked to the Olympic Charter, which expressly prohibited racial discrimination when it was written up in the mid-1890s. And because racial discrimination was prohibited, the reality of apartheid after 1948 was clearly in contradiction of Olympic rules and principles, and particularly against the values of sport as a haven of fairness, merit, and equality, at least in theory. The first boycott in sport on an international level may have been at the 1934 British Empire Games, the precursor of what today are the Commonwealth Games. Those games were supposed to take place in Johannesburg, but the hosting rights were taken away from Egoli, the city of gold, due to South Africa's unwillingness to welcome Black African athletes and Asian athletes. Note the date. This is 14 years before the rise of apartheid. As a result, the games were in fact moved to London, but there was a limit to this kind of white liberal distaste with segregation, because South Africa was in fact allowed to field an all-white team in London. Father Trevor Huddleston is most famous for his leadership in the anti-apartheid movement, but few people remember that he was probably the first influential public figure to call for an anti-apartheid sport boycott in a media interview in 1954, when Father Huddleston stated that because the union is so good at sport, such isolation would shake its self-assurance very severely. Fantastic though it may sound, it may be an extraordinarily effective blow to the racialism which has brought it into being. In 1955, the Freedom Charter was adopted at the Congress of the People in Kliptown, right outside Soweto, Johannesburg, and sport was incorporated in the broader quest for political and cultural liberation in South Africa. That same year, Dennis Brutus, teacher, poet, activist, founded the first organized group that called for the eligibility of all South Africans to represent the country in international sporting competitions, the Coordinating Committee for International Recognition in Sport. It only lasted about a year. It disbanded quickly due largely to police repression. Brutus later wrote an article in which he claimed that the sport boycott movement was created under the watchful eye of the security branch, the special branch, the security police of South Africa. But even though it disbanded quickly, it established the importance of sport as a key arena in which to define South African citizenship and national identity. In response to Dennis Brutus and the emergence of an organized boycott movement, the apartheid regime issued its first sport policy. Again, not many people realize that there was never a law on the books during apartheid that prohibited mixed team sport. There were plenty of other heinous racist laws, of course, that made integrated sport virtually impossible. But the Pretoria regime felt compelled to issue this first sport policy in a media briefing by Ebenezer Donges, the Minister of the Interior, in June '56. It stated clearly that whites and blacks should organize their sporting activities separately, and there should be no interracial competitions within South Africa. Mixing of races and teams should be avoided, and sportsmen from other lands should respect the country's customs as she respected theirs. This, incidentally, might have been the same kind of quotation that could have come out of a commissioner of the Southeastern Conference in the United States during the 1950s, right, in opposition to the civil rights movement and drives to integrate university sports and other forms of sport in the United States. There's also an implicit threat that anyone who challenged this racist segregationist order would run into trouble with the authorities. And it says no travel facilities would be granted to people guilty of such subversive intentions as trying to squeeze white South Africans out of international competitions. Instead of being silenced, activists built the first anti-racist coalition of Black amateur sports bodies in 1958 called the South African Sports Association. And there were even some, very few, but some white members and supporters among the weightlifters, for example. And you'll note on this flyer from their first conference that the famous novelist and white liberal Alan Paton was the keynote speaker. This built pressure to sanction South Africa. And in 1963, just 3 years after the Sharpeville massacre, Dennis Brutus was arrested trying to cross into Mozambique while he was en route to an IOC meeting where the South African question would be addressed. Fearing that he would be killed by the police since no one knew that he had left the country, he attempted an escape in central Johannesburg and he was shot by the arresting officer. He was eventually patched up after a long wait, bleeding out in front of the Shell Corporation headquarters because the wrong ambulance had arrived. It was for whites only. And then his reward was to be taken to Robben Island to join Mandela and the other political prisoners. When the IOC heard about this, they issued a declaration known as the Baden-Baden Declaration after the city in West Germany where the meeting was held, saying essentially that if South Africa did not accept the spirit of the Olympic Code and didn't change its practice of racial discrimination in sports, it would be debarred from entering the next Olympics. Well, lo and behold, the government in South Africa refused to change its ways, and South Africa was excluded from the Tokyo Olympics. 2 years later, Brutus got an exit visa after his sentence expired, and he went into exile in London, where he reorganized the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, which was the successor group to SASA. Amazingly, the following year, the IOC sent a commission of inquiry that discovered that there was no racial discrimination in South African sport. And I think this is a clear indication of the kind of Eurocentrism and white racism that was pervasive in the IOC at the time. Indeed, there was only one sub-Saharan African member in the IOC at the time, Adetona of Nigeria. As a result of this commission of inquiry, the IOC invited South Africa to the famous Mexico City Olympics of '68. And we remember that particular Olympics because of the silent gesture of Tommy Smith and John Carlos and the other protests by Lee Evans and many other African-American athletes that were part of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. But few remember that African-American athletes also cooperated with SANROC, with the Supreme Council for Sport in Africa and other allies to exclude South Africa at the last moment, and they succeeded in doing this. So this is an example of tremendous Pan-African mobilization that raised awareness of injustice. It compelled those international sports institutions to impose sanctions on South Africa and to take their anti-discrimination statutes seriously. It also strengthened Black unity and solidarity and led in 1970 to the expulsion of South Africa from the Olympics, the first country to ever be expelled. In the 1970s, the effort of sports activists turned to enforcing the boycott against South Africa and also to excluding Rhodesia, which incidentally had been also kept away from Mexico '68, but had been re-invited to attend the Munich '72 Olympics. Fortunately, that did not happen, thanks again to this Pan-African mobilization. Since time is of the essence here, I'm going to move rather quickly here. The '76 Montreal boycott by 24 African countries was already mentioned by Michelle Sikes and is another example of this mounting pressure on South Africa. I don't have time to go into what was happening inside South Africa, but I do want to just open this parenthesis and highlight the fact that there was activism within South Africa. The pressure wasn't just being brought from outside. And the main force in this overall movement was the South African Council on Sport, which organized mixed events and became essentially the domestic arm of the boycott movement. And it's known for its famous slogan, "No normal sport in an abnormal society." You have to end apartheid, in other words, in order to have meritocratic sport. And many SACOS leaders were persecuted by the regime. International pressure came in all sorts of forms after this, including from the United Nations, which developed a list of athletes that were breaking the boycott, over 2,500 of them between 1980 and 1987, including about a third of those were Americans. The boycott ended in 1991-92, mainly as an ANC, African National Congress, reward to the white minority in South Africa for agreeing to participate in political negotiations to end apartheid. South Africa sent a team that was 80% white to the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, They marched behind the Olympic flag, and they used the Ode to Joy as their anthem. And the Mandela administration after 94 used sports deliberately to try and forge a democratic, inclusive national identity, what Archbishop Tutu and others refer to as rainbow nationalism. However, in pursuit of this kind of strategy, elite performance sports were prioritized at the expense of the development and upliftment of grassroots sports. So I'm just going to close by saying that this Black-led Olympic boycott of South Africa boosted the overall liberation struggle by increasing awareness of racism in South Africa. Sports fans are notoriously sort of not in tune with high politics and sometimes with low politics too. And this popularized the anti-apartheid movement internationally. It also denied white supremacy opportunities to use sport for self-glorification. And it gave meaning and purpose to the widely held belief that sports must be fair, democratic, and accessible to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And at this time, I believe we can begin our discussion. And I see some people are clapping, so you know how to use the reactions. If you have questions, can you use the raise hand function and put it that way? If you do put it in the chat, I might see it, but sometimes multitasking through these things can be a little bit daunting. And as I've already realized that the speakers had assumed one order, and then I had thought it was another order. So apologies to the speakers who might have been thrown off a little bit there. I also want to say, as Abdul has said, that I had said that Guinea had withdrawn from the Olympics, and they had as of about 2 a.m. my time last night, but they've turned around and said they're going to come back again. So they have changed, and I've updated my stats quickly, and I'm going to throw into the chat a PDF with some updated charts if anybody wants that sort of thing. So meantime, let's see, do I see questions here? I'm looking, I don't yet see any questions. Maybe the panelists have questions for each other at this point. And again, if you know how to, you click the reactions button, and then you can raise your hand there to have a question. Anyone want to start us off here? I actually
Can you hear me?
Now we can, Simone, yes.
Go ahead, Simone.
I have a quick question for Peter, but this is about South Africa. But before 1994, before the independence of South Africa, all right, what was happening, you know, in terms of South African participation in the Olympics? Because I know that South Africa has a lot of medals. They have more medals than anybody, but most of them were acquired, you know, before the end of apartheid. Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening at that time, you know, in this first, Second World War, and in South Africa participation in the Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, this would require a lot of time to go into sufficient detail, but the Twitter version of the story, if you will, is that the white South African National Olympic Committee began attending the Olympics from very early on, and all of the medals that South Africa won prior to 1992, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly, you know, during the time that they were allowed to participate, were won by white athletes. And I believe most, if not all of those, were white men. Again, I don't have all the statistics at my disposal, but South Africa participated, you know, from the very earliest Olympics all the way through the Rome Olympics of 1960. And then they were not allowed to participate from Tokyo 64 until their re-entry in 1992 at the Barcelona Games. And I'm only talking about the summer games, obviously. The Winter Games is a whole other ball of wax, and I don't believe South Africa ever participated in the Winter Olympics. But yeah, only white athletes were allowed to participate prior to 1992. Now, having said that, the South African regime tried to, re-enter the Olympics in a whole number of underhanded ways, tried to, do some reforms that, for example, would, with government approval, allow certain Black athletes, be they African colored or Indian, to participate in trials. But, it was a typical sort of, 1970s high wire act where they would make cosmetic reforms to make it appear to the international community that substantive change was happening within South Africa while they retained, the architecture of apartheid intact. And so thankfully, largely due to the work of the anti-apartheid movement, not just in sport, but more broadly, nobody ended up buying these so-called reforms that first Forster and then Botha and others tried to initiate. So South African sport at the elite level was segregated for a long time. It started to change in the late 70s, early 80s, but amateur sport remained by and large, and school sport remained largely segregated. So that's a very short version of a long and complicated story.
Martha, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I see a hand up, the African Studies Association. Is that Catherine? I think you may have a question.
Oh, it's Alex.
Alex,
Simon,
sorry.
would you mind sharing a little bit with us about the Algerians who ran for France?
Did we lose Simon?
It looks like we might have lost Simon.
Yeah, his microphone seems to be on, but his video is off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, but no video.
But no video. Okay, all right, good. So yeah. So I'm sure now you can see me too, right? So the first one is Ahmed Buharif El-Wafi. He was enlisted in the French military, just like all Algerians before Algeria got the independence in 1964. So 64-62. But anyway, he was in the French military, and then they discovered that he had good qualities, and they decided to send him to a sport competition in France. So he went and competed, and he was good. So they tried to, they got him to participate in the 1924 Summer Olympics in Paris, but he was not used to the environment. But anyway, that was his first participation, and he came 7th. But he continued, and he got prepared. Prepared himself for the competition in I think it was in Melbourne. No, in Amsterdam. All right, the next competition was in Amsterdam. So he went to the competition in Amsterdam and then came first. Now, he became a celebrity. He was invited to the United States. But when he came to the United States, he was considered, people considered him a professional athlete. So after his tour of the United States, he was demoted. He was not demoted, but he was not allowed to participate anymore in the Olympics or in many competitions, because from that point on, he was regarded as a professional rather than an amateur. And Pierre de Coubertin, the story was that the Olympics was for amateurs and not for professionals. So he was banned for the games, for the next game, just because of that. And he ended up living the rest of his life probably in poverty, and was killed when he was 61 in a cafe. So that is the story of Ahmed Buharif El-Wafi. But on the other side, there was another Algerian whose name was Alain Mimoun. And Alain Mimoun, his name was Ali in the first place, same trajectory. He was he went to French, he was part of the French military, and then he started, competing because they discovered again that as it usually happens, that he had a lot of talent. When it comes to Africans, it's all about physicality, innate qualities, and so on and so forth. So, but anyway, he joined the French team. He converted to Catholicism. His name was Ali, and then he became Alain Mimoun, and he was part of the French team. But he was running at a time when there was the famous long distance runner from Czechoslovakia, Zaputek, and he could not win anything. But eventually in 1958, in 1956 in Melbourne, he was able to win, and he was able to beat Zaputek. But Zaputek had been operated on. He was not doing well, but anyway, Mimoun won. So he became the big French hero. All right, he was converted to Catholicism. His wife was French, so his trajectory was completely different from that of El-Wafi, and he became a French hero. So until this day, actually he was the third athlete to win, the marathon for France. The first one was a guy named Matteo, I think, I can't remember the name, but the second one was El-Wafi, and the third one was Mimoun. So here you have two athletes, different, all of them from Algeria, from a colonized country, and different trajectories in terms of fame and in terms of fate also, because Mimoun became a very famous athlete in France. I think he was even inducted, or he was even declared the greatest French athlete of the 20th century, I think. But that's the story of those two athletes. It is not so much different from what is happening today. If you have Mo Farah, for example, running for England, it is not so much different, but it is interesting that practices that took place before colonization are still taking place after colonization. And for me, it is because of the distribution of power that exists in the world that things like that happen the way they happen.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Martha, do you want me to read those out?
Yes, that would be great.
Gretchen Bauer asked, how are members of the IOC chosen? And how can there be, for all practical purposes, no representation from any African countries, 25% of countries?
I think that this question may be for me, but anybody can answer. What I can say is that I'm not sure how they are chosen, but when you look at the committee itself, there are individuals from different countries. There is no single country that absolutely dominates the IOC executive committee. I know that there are maybe two people from Belgium. The former president of the IOC, Jacques Roche, who is from Belgium, he's an honorary member. But what I can say for sure is that they are Africans. It's not that there are no Africans. There are two Africans. One is, her name is Coventry. Her last name is Coventry. She's from Zimbabwe. She's actually the current Minister of Sports in Zimbabwe. She's white, but she's a very famous swimmer, and she won many medals for Zimbabwe, even under Mugabe. So you have her, and then you have Nawal El Mutawakil, who is probably the most famous athlete, runner from the Arab world in the Olympics. She's from Morocco. So those are the two Africans, but there is no Black African. The whole sub-Saharan Africa has been ignored in that. So there are issues of representation in all these big organizations, transnational organizations, and Africans are always the least represented in all of that.
Okay, and actually now I've caught up with the things in the chat here. So another question actually is from Nobubele to Michelle, and she's very much looking forward to the book on Kenyan women, and wonders what the research is saying about the experiences of Kenyan women at the time, particularly how they navigated between a possibly white colonialism and African patriarchy. Is there anything there?
Thank you so much, Nobu, for that fantastic question. And that is at the core of the book. So as Peter said, the Twitter version is that there was this extraordinary cohort of Kenyan women who navigated this fragile period by having to deal with both of those aspects you mentioned. And I argue that that's because they took advantage of these burgeoning, fresh, new sport opportunities at the global level, particularly after you can start to earn properly through the sport once the sport professionalizes, and then turn these women who succeed in doing so turn to local ideas of generous wealth, whereby prosperity is shared with the community. And these pioneering female athletes are thereby able to use those sort of longer, older, more established traditions to forge successful careers. And I definitely think that their choices reveal the flexibility of African gender norms in how they go about navigating that really that early period is, I think, the really most interesting, fascinating part of this story. And how they channel their international gains through these local practices is just the core of it. But if I could, I'd also just want to also add on to the previous question about the IOC, and that is the gender dynamic too. And it wasn't until 1984 that any women were members of the IOC. We had a wholly white, wholly male International Olympic Committee until 2 women were elected in 84. And how that came to be is that the IOC is this very insular, self-replicating body that elects its own members, and those members are chosen from the upper class of countries. And the historical, as Simone said, the power dynamics that we still see today were very much at play throughout the 20th century. So with regard to the membership of the IOC. So I think that's a really good question. The question that still isn't answered is how can it still be that way, and why does it carry on this way? I don't know. As a historian, I'll leave that to Nobu and Martha and Simone, our political scientists, sociologists, contemporary people. But could I just also ask Nobu a question? Your presentation was fantastic, and so rich, and I think I would love to know if you're able to comment on any sort of comparability you can see in these particular cases that are emerging in Southern Africa and in Eastern Africa and the different countries. Are you able to kind of kind of pull out what they're doing at the moment. Are they working together on this issue? Are they learning from each other the lessons that are coming before? Is there any kind of collaboration across the continent in that respect, or just any sort of national linkages across these different cases? If you're aware of any, I would love to learn about. If you're there.
The load shedding may make it delay a bit, but I know that Nobu has been also having a conversation in the chat, and there was a question from Busolo Milumu around whether or not these tests were mainly applied to athletics or running, or do they happen in other sports? And Nobu has pointed out that it's just the runners have captured our interest right now, that may be an area where there's more women from the global South. But it looks like Nobu is coming on now. Nobu, can you unmute, or how is the load shedding helping or not? This is one of the issues, and it just totally shows the inequities that we have to deal with between the global South and the global North, and the issues of trying to have equal space on the platforms, whether it's the Zoom platform or the metal platform. When you have to deal with load shedding, it's just not possible. So yeah, she's typing in, she has, yeah, so she's had to move a bit and is better at typing at this point. So, but I do think that the questions that Nobu raises and that stark contrast of the policing of Black women's bodies in particular is something that I think we all have to become an activist around. And I know that there's work being done around testosterone and around trans athletes and other things. But Caster Semenya's case, I think, first brought it into really stark contrast for a lot of people. But it is something that even if we're not athletes, even if we're not involved in the Olympics, it just seems so deeply unfair and problematic that there is something that we all need to somehow do something about it. Other questions, and I don't know. Go ahead, Simon.
Well, I'd like to say something about that. I mean, there are two dimensions to this. You have women who are considered a little bit more masculine, all right? And then, of course, when they excel, there is a tendency to try to, interpret the excellence in terms of the being masculine, all right? So that's one aspect of it. But there's another aspect of it that is a little bit more insidious to me. It is the fact that Africans usually, the Black body usually has been portrayed in history as being more physical, more naturally physical than being intellectual. So whenever an African succeeds in sports, it's all because of their physicality or their athleticism. You have, for example, the case of Serena Williams in tennis. People up to this day, people have not come to terms with the way she is built. But when you have another athlete that is not Black and that is succeeding, that is huge, like all these shot put women or whatever, it is not usually about, I mean, they are strong, they have power, but it is not put in, if you want, in contradiction with their mental abilities. And that has been a constant in sports. That's why when we win medals, when Africans win medals in the Olympics, especially Black people win medals in the Olympics, it is always a problem. Is it nature or is it that they practice? I mean, personally, I went to Ethiopia. I thought for a long time that Ethiopians were very good because simply they lived in altitude. But I saw the type of programs that they have. They have very good programs, you know, and then it is the same thing in Kenya. So, you know, this is always there when it comes to African athletes, whether they are women or men.
Right, and I want to read out what Nobu's been typing here. She has to type it out in the chat, and I want to make sure that it's in the record, in the audio record as well. So she's also talking about beyond a third category, we could take from African queer scholarship, where there have been rich discussions about female masculinities and masculinities without men. This is great theorization that explains how African masculinities would have never fit the gender binary mold in any case. So whether you test them or not, they're already not going to meet those standards. And then she writes, consider how the Black domestic worker violates the fragile, weak image of white women. These ways of being woman are present in sport as well. And so I think that one of the, I mean, I'm getting chills right now, partly because there's the wind blowing, but also because I think the promise of sports studies is not just to stay in sport. It actually breaks open a lot of the other areas of domesticity or ways of thinking about how people relate to each other and how we think about who is the norm across all kinds of dimensions. We could talk about the academy. We could talk about economics in different labor sectors and things like that. So I feel like that this is where the promise, when we really look at these issues and the physicalities and the way that it's understood, historicized, categorized, police and all that there's so much that we can take from sports studies and put elsewhere. So, and then I guess there's a second question here from Busolo Mulimo, was also curious because Busolo has been following the WNBA, a predominantly Black women basketball league in the United States, and has been impressed with their inclusion of all women. And it's interesting now that they have the first trans and non-binary athlete, Laisha Renee Clarendon. And Peter's also commenting on that in the chat. So maybe Peter, you want to pick up on that?
Well, mine was just a comment to follow up on that excellent point that Busolo just made, and that is that the WNBA is often on the cutting edge of some of these intersections between race and gender and power in sports. For example, the Indiana Fever of the WNBA were the first team to take a knee before a game, you know, a year before Colin Kaepernick did for the San Francisco 49ers. Yet the historical record often overlooks that, which is quite telling in so many ways.
Yes, and then Nobu points out though, but the US has other issues when it comes to Black athletes, because you must also think about the commercial value of Black on Black brutality. And yeah, there's that too. I just, the new Space Jam movie came out, and I actually was thinking about that a little bit with I didn't see the whole movie, but just little bits of it. But yeah, we have some interesting.
So I have a question for everybody. Can anybody predict what's going to happen at the Olympics in the next 2 weeks in terms of, you know, dealing with these issues in the open? Because it is quite remarkable that, you know, yesterday the whole US team, you know, they took the knee before, not just the US, actually Sweden also, they took the knee before the games, the soccer game. So I don't know what's going to happen in the next few days. Anybody can predict something or say something, can guess something?
Yeah, and whether the IOC is going to force Rule 50 down on everybody. They've allowed that. I mean, imagine raising a fist in 1968 versus taking a knee in 2021.
Well,
yeah.
They are behind. They are behind when it comes to history, but we're going to pull them. I don't know who and how they're going to be pulled, you know, in these games, but somebody is going to do something. Naomi Osaka, somebody is going to do something. I'm sure. I don't know if anybody can guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's
I have $100,000 for the person who is going to guess right.
We need some economists in the group.
Yeah. Well, there's also other issues that might rise that, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian issue or the China, Taipei, Taiwan issue. We've seen multiple things that can emerge. And let's see. There's a couple of other points. Petra points out in the chat that there's also Maya Moores, who's a WNBA star, her incarceration activism. She was at the top of her game, but she took off a whole season to focus on dealing with the incarceration issues in the United States. And then Busolo also writes, Nobu, I understand, but I also see a lot of similarities, especially from the intersectionality perspectives. I find Black women, whether in the US or Africa, will always be masculinized when they succeed exceptionally, which I think gets back to some of the other issues that we've been talking about, and how, well, I think in general, in terms of African studies, we're always trying to really focus on African issues, and also not in post-colonial ways, to not always be comparing things to the global North, to Europe, to North America, and things like that. And so it's a constant process to contextualize and see what we have in front of us without comparing it. Catherine, you have your hand up, and I don't know if we're at time right now. I think we might at time.
Yeah, we are running up on time, and so I thought I would ask one last question, unless anyone else had one. So I'll put it out there. If someone else would like to ask, I'm happy to leave my question unanswered. But I was hoping to end on a more uplifting note and ask each of the panelists, what are you looking forward to seeing in the next 2 weeks? Or what do you hope to see in the next 2 weeks? Or what should we, as, I TiVo the Olympics, what should I be watching for? What's exciting to come?
I could dive in on that. I think you should watch the women's track and field events. This will come as no surprise that I say this, and all track and field events. And in particular, there's going to be a fantastic showdown between Faith Kipyegon in Kenya, and she just ran a phenomenally fast mile during one of these Diamond League meets. So she'll be one to watch, and I'm so excited. I have to say, it's an American, but Athing is just the most beautiful runner I've ever seen, running in the 800 meters. So those would be my two events that you should focus on: the women's 800, the women's 1500, or depending on what they all enter. But there are no abouts. Great question.
And I'll say two things. One, I know that Zambia did not do so well in their first game, the women's football team, but I think being there, being at the Olympics is quite an achievement for them, and then to get that international exposure. But secondly, I would also say is we haven't really talked about the Paralympics, and there is a huge movement in disability sport on the continent. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think that's something that over the next couple of years, Sports Africa, I know that we hope to do more in that area and pay attention to that a lot more.
Well, I'm really excited by the prospect of the rivalry between Kenya and Ethiopia when it comes to track and field. It is always something. I mean, you have to be in Kenya, you have to be in Ethiopia to see how exciting, those races are in those countries. So that is something that I'm going to be looking at. And then what I would see is, I would like to see the emergence of new talents, or let's say new athletes that are going to completely shatter our expectations, our traditional expectations, in terms of, knowing or expecting that this person from this place will win everything and whatever. So I want some kind of disruption in the way the results in the way we get, I mean, results at the Olympics. So those are the things that I will be excited about.
And to be provocative, I'll say, I hope that these are the last Olympics we ever see. It's an idea whose time has come.
Yeah.
Has passed. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
I mean, you're talking about the last Olympics or the last Olympics in this format?
Last Olympics.
But we know already who is going to organize the 2032 Olympics. That's Brisbane in
Yes, because there were no competitors. Nobody wanted them except the poor souls of Brisbane, Australia.
Yeah, and there's a very strong no Olympics movement in LA, and there's so many issues that have come up. I will note that Nobu has written that for her, she's looking for women's football, and then perhaps, and this maybe relates to Peter's point, is to see how competing under COVID regulations works out. And I think in the future, well, I'm sure that this pandemic is not going to be the last thing that interrupts the Olympics so much. So we also, Bosolo is looking for skateboarding and women's football. So, we do want to be mindful of time. I think we're a little bit over at this point. Alex, Catherine, anything that you would like to say from the ASA? Although again, I do want to really encourage everybody to continue your membership in the ASA and then join Sports Africa for us. That would be wonderful. We have a lot of events online. We've really done a lot of work online over the past couple of years, and I think we'll continue to do that. We will have panels at the ASA. There's all sorts of things in the works, so please do come to us. Gerard, do you want to say anything? I'm not sure if you're still there, Gerard. One last thing, and then maybe we'll pass it over to the ASA.
No, I don't. I just wanted to make a quick comment about Nigeria made in US at the Olympics basketball.
Yes, they did. Surprise, surprise. There we go. The men's basketball, that is. Yeah. All right, Alex, Catherine, anything from the ASA that you want to send us off with? Maybe not.
I just want to say thanks to everyone who was able to be with us today. And please don't forget that this recording will be available in future for free on YouTube. And we hope to see you in future at more member events, much like this one. We hope to partner with Sports Africa and other coordinate organizations for the rest of 2021 and beyond. So thank you so much to all of our speakers and all of our guests.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Good weekend.
Thanks to the audience for coming too. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.